Good. I was asked if I would spell out 3 important issues that come out of what I've been doing, and I think these are: first, that mortgages do not serve the great majority of urban households in developing countries. I know many of you are involved in mortgages. Unfortunately, very, very few people in Africa and elsewhere in the developing world have any hope of having a mortgage at all, and you certainly wouldn't regard them as a good borrowing risk. Secondly, governments have taken the enabling approach to mean that they can withdraw from housing supply, but they haven't engaged in the enabling approach's 6 inputs to housing sufficiently for the enabling approach to work. So there's been extended shortfalls in housing supply. And unfortunately, the enabling approach probably has nothing at all to say to the bottom 25% of the population. I came at that conclusion from having written a book on homelessness in 9 developing countries, 4 of them in Africa. And the bottom 25% are not going to be touched by the market. They really aren't. Somebody's got to get in there and do something directly for the bottom 20%, 25% or more. It's very directional, this thing. You've got to point it at the... Right, I think it's fair enough for us to assess the enabling strategy by its own parameters. And way back, I think it was in the 1993 shelter strategy paper from the World Bank, we got this wonderful table of the do's and don'ts of the enabling strategy. For an English speaker who's punctilious about punctuation, it's really very difficult because you don't know whether to put an apostrophe on do's, but of course you shouldn't because it's a plural, but it looks silly, it looks like DOS. So anyway, I haven't put an apostrophe. So the do's and don'ts of housing finance. And I'm going to look at 3 sets. The 2 finance sets, but also the set that comes before it about land, because housing finance depends on property rights, and without property rights there's no lending. So in the do's and don'ts, the do in land Hello? Yeah, we are now. Okay. Regularize land tenure, expand land registration, privatize public housing stock, and establish property taxation. Some of those have been done, some of them haven't. And the don'ts: don't engage in mass eviction, don't institute costly titling systems, don't nationalize land, and don't discourage land transactions. And without property rights, we get very little lending. This really, what am I doing wrong? Aha. It's that one. Okay. Sorry. These beautiful little things, they look well designed, and they are well designed, aren't they? All Apple design is from a man who qualified in Newcastle, which is where I live. But it's not as easy to use as some I've come across. So developing property rights under the enabling approach. It's been assumed, and our friend Hernando de Soto has pushed this really hard and made many millions of bucks for his organization pushing this. It assumes that regularization of property rights will lead to housing improvement, but in my experience of sub-Saharan Africa, many don't particularly want to spend money on housing improvement, and they don't need the regularization of property rights. They can't afford it, and if they get regularization of property, they don't necessarily improve. In Malawi, for instance, where they've been able to regularize property for a very long time, very, very few people do it. Unless they want to sell their plot, and I'll come to that later, they don't regularize, because once they regularize, they've got to pay tax, and also they're cut off from all the informal systems that they get by having allegiance to the chief, like being able to use the local graveyard. So, and for many other reasons across sub-Saharan Africa anyway, regularization of property rights is not necessarily a thing that people want. It assumes that regularization will lead to a market in used housing. But there are other factors against the idea of a market in used housing. Nobody in Ghana, outside a very small elite, nobody will sell their house. They would rather sell their grandmother. And their house is much more like their grandmother than it's like their car in how they regard the house. They simply won't sell. In sub-Saharan Africa, 95% of the population who live north of the Zambezi River won't sell their house. So there is not going to be a secondary market in housing. It just won't happen. So why do we need regularization? And thirdly, regularization was meant to lead to bankable land. But many banks won't lend on regularized plots once they're regularized. They won't in Malawi, for instance. They certainly won't in Ghana. And many householders won't borrow because borrowing brings debt and interest rates and all sorts of other things. And there are many householders who just won't borrow. Come on. Yeah, I went through one, didn't I? Here we are. Many countries have used over-expensive methods in developing their property rights. They use cadastral surveys, I can explain what that is if anybody doesn't know, which are very expensive per plot. So they have very high transaction costs of regularizing property. Registration often involves unwanted costs, such as property taxes, although I'm surprised how few cities collect the taxes that they're entitled to. And the exclusion from benefits of customary land rights, as I've said before. There are also some gender issues sometimes in changing from customary rights to regular rights. Customary rights are sometimes much better on behalf of widows and orphans than are the regularized systems. Certainly in Malawi, anybody who's looking after gender rights wouldn't advise anybody to regularize their land. So then we come to the nub, to the focus of our issue here, housing finance. Having looked at land and seen that land is a very important background, without which it's very difficult to have housing finance. Let's look at the do's and don'ts of finance. And there are two. The first one is developing mortgage finance. So do allow private sector to lend, do lend at positive or market rates, do enforce foreclosure laws, do ensure prudential regulations, do introduce better loan instruments. On the don't side, don't allow interest rate subsidies, don't discriminate against rental housing, don't neglect resource mobilization, and don't allow high default rates. Oh, thank you. Thank you. I need 3 hands. Thank you. And then the second main group of things here is rationalizing subsidies. So do make subsidies transparent, do target subsidies to the poor, do subsidize people, not houses, and do subject subsidies to review. And on the don'ts, don't build subsidized public housing, don't allow for hidden subsidies, don't let subsidies distort prices, and don't use rent control as subsidy. I'd like us to look first at what we mean by affordable housing. We're going to be looking at affordable housing. We're going to use the phrase affordable housing lots and lots of times this next 2 days, because that's really what housing finance is about for people like me, affordable housing. And definitions of affordable housing include measures of decency or adequacy. It's not just any old structure. So it has to be in a place where it's helpful for people to live. It's got to have a certain amount of structural integrity, servicing, and so forth. It's usually targeted at low and middle income households. And we'll see later and through this talk how the middle income has been a get out of jail free card for governments. They've said, we are going to build for low and middle income housing, or we are going to lend for low and middle income households. And because the middle income is there, they can go right to the top of the middle income bracket and lend there and think that they've done something good. And it's almost always refers to the buying of housing. What is affordable for people to buy? That's the usual context. And it assumes that the dwellings will fulfill all regulations, so they've got to be high quality, and that they'll be bankable. So affordable housing is formal, good quality, bankable, and somehow affordable. Sometimes subsidies assumed, and sometimes it's actually stated. But we've seen that subsidy is one of the don'ts. Let's just have a look at the Western idea of affordable housing, because I suspect quite a lot of us around the table are bringing in Western ideas of affordable society, because that's what most of the discourse that you come across from bankers in Africa, this is the concept that they talk in. So you've got rental housing for the lower income people, and you've got owner-occupier housing for the higher income people, and affordable housing is tucked into the bottom of the owner-occupied housing. Tucked right into the bottom there. That's the Western model. And for developing countries, certainly sub-Saharan Africa, we change rental into informal sector and owner-occupation into formal sector, and the affordable housing is still tucked into that bit just at the bottom end of the formal sector. But actually, the position is much closer to this, that the informal sector provides almost everybody with their housing, way up into the 80% of the population. They're all housed by the informal sector. And the formal sector is tiny and only works for a very small section of the population who are either at the top of the income scale or have formal sector housing built into their work, like some civil servants, for instance. And the affordable housing is tucked into the bottom of that formal sector, but it means that you're much further up the income scale than you would be in the Western context. In my city, affordable housing means housing that costs enough, is cheap enough for people in the middle of the income scale to afford, and that's the Western concept. But actually, affordable housing, as it is built in Africa and much of Asia and Latin America, is only affordable to people who are up in the 90th percentile of the population. I've got figures for that. I'm speaking from experience. In the last 4 years, I've written 5 UN Habitat Housing Sector profiles, Malawi, Ghana, Zambia, Liberia, and Lesotho, and I'm just starting on Guyana. And in all of those places, this is the case, in every single one of them. And we did some work in Ethiopia, and it's the same in Ethiopia. And then there's another syndrome that we've got to remember. There's the syndrome that if I had that much money, I wouldn't live there. And when you look at affordable housing, and the one on your right is the Echo homes being built by a philanthropic organization from America to OPIC standards, international standards, just outside Robertsville International Airport in Liberia. Shelter Africa, I think, have been part of the funding for it. They cost $39,000 for a 2-room dwelling way out of the city. Half an hour nearer the center of the city is a place called Peace Island, squatter settlement behind the new Ministry of the Interior building, and you can build 4 rooms in Peace Island for much less, $10,000 to $15,000. As I drove out there with my UN Habitat driver, who's a graduate in forestry, I asked him to go so we could take a photograph just before we left the country during the profiling exercise. And as I got back in the car, I said to him, $39,000, Joseph. He said, hey, if I had $39,000, I would build a 5-bedroom house, and then I would build another 4-bedroom house and rent it out. If I had that much money, I wouldn't live there. Rental housing is the affordable housing in much of the developing world. But it's almost completely ignored in government policy. There's an unspoken assumption that house ownership is a universal aspiration, and it simply isn't true. Renting is so important that it should be a really substantial part of housing policy, and it's been seriously neglected over the last 20 years. But rental housing is essential. It provides flexibility for people who need to move about. It accommodates more women than men. It's providing an income, very important indeed, providing an income for the owners who are letting out rooms. Without rental rooms, many of these people couldn't own those houses. And it increases residential density. Few governments have done anything at all to encourage rental housing. And very few even mention rental housing in their government publications and policies. A few have removed or modified rent controls, but somehow the rent control philosophy still sticks. If you go to Cairo, people still leave their properties empty for the whole of their children's childhood because they don't want to rent them out because of the thought patterns of what happened during rent control when people wouldn't move out. And most rental is privately provided. There's almost no mass housing rental anymore. The photograph, by the way, is in Shanghai. Rental housing is important to relatively poor self-help builders who build rooms for rent, even though government policy is unfavorable. I did some work in Kumasi. I've done lots of work in Kumasi in Ghana. We did some work in 1999 on housing supply, and we found that the owners who rented out rooms had less income, or were poorer, were further down the income scale than owners who did not rent out rooms. So rental housing allows ownership to pass down the income scale because it provides the income, even though rents in Ghana are so tiny that it takes 66 years to pay off the cost of the room. So it's not even as if they're market rents. But the income trickling in allows people to manage things like maintenance. Those two pictures are both in Kumasi in Ghana, my city. Much public rental housing has been sold off or given away. In Zambia, in Kitwe, a city I worked in for 3 years, they had lots and lots of institutional housing owned by the council and the mine. And under President Chiluba, in the 90s, they were selling off council housing. And the famous story is that President Chiluba visited a woman in Buchi, which is one of the council estates in Kitwe, which I used to know very well. And he was sitting in a house having tea with her, and she said she was having the opportunity to buy her house. And he said to her, "What are you going to pay?" And she told him, and he said, "You can't pay that, it's worth nothing." And so because the president had said that this house was worth nothing, Kitwe City Council had to give away all its municipal housing. Fortunately, the giving away also involved getting back all the rent arrears. So there was some income, but nothing like as much. The fact that selling off housing is not necessarily a housing policy is shown by what happened in Great Britain. People look at our rent to buy that was done by Mrs. Thatcher under her notorious government of 14 years. Dreadful time in Britain, absolutely dreadful time. They sold off the council housing, but the councils were not allowed by law to spend the income on housing. So you see, it wasn't a housing policy at all. It was a policy to take power away from the local authorities. Oddly enough, selling off rental housing to the occupants doesn't necessarily increase home ownership. You would have thought it would, but it doesn't necessarily, because the people who now own the house can't afford to maintain it, so they rent it out and move elsewhere. Happens in Zambia. It's even happening in the famous IHDP housing in Ethiopia. Many of the allocatees can't afford the dwelling. They can afford the deposit, but that's all. And then they move out and rent it out. So you now have an increase in the private sector instead, and it's greatly increased the importance. Those two dwellings, both of them are in Zambia. Informal housing has increasingly become a source of rental income and rental housing over the last 20 years. And poor landlords tend to rent to poor tenants and live in the same structure with them. Oddly enough, the tenants probably have a higher per capita income than the landlord. The only difference in their economic state is age. We did some work on our housing supply in Ghana, and I worked with Ken Willis, an econometrician, and we did some analysis which said, okay, if you increase the value of a variable by 10%, 20%, 30%, what does that do to tenure? And we found that the thing that really, really affected tenure in Ghana was age. Income didn't, it was age. So renters are young owners. The photograph, by the way, is Kabele housing in Addis Ababa, taken this year. Affordable housing discourse is also based on the idea of the property ladder. If you get on the property ladder while you're young, you'll be able to move up the property ladder as you become wealthier and your household grows and you've got more children. Yeah? Absolutely basic to the affordable house. So if we sell somebody a very cheap, very small house, it allows them then to move on into better things. It's used by policymakers, by investors, by estate developers in the rapidly urbanizing world. I have spoken to bankers and property developers in 6 African countries in the last 5 years. The 4 I've worked on for profiles, plus Ethiopia and Sierra Leone. And they all say the same thing. Get people onto the property ladder. But housing is seen as something to pass on to children. It's not seen as something to sell. It's seen as security from eviction and an income from renting in old age. It's not a way up the property ladder. If you sell somebody a small dwelling when they are young, they are likely to be stuck in it. Now, fortunately, another thing I've done some work on, I've written a book on the transformation of government-built housing by self-help. Liverpool University Press, 2000. You can still get copies in the remaindered book sections, where we worked in Egypt and Bangladesh and Zimbabwe and Ghana. And we found that people improve their housing without moving. Going clockwise from the extreme left, we've got Egypt, Cairo, with the 5-story walk-up blocks being extended, and then a plan of one of those with the original dwelling shaded and the new bit added on. On the next one is in India, on some 2-story flats that were built at the time of partition and have now been extended to 3 and 4 stories high, and as many as 6 rooms from front to back, so that people live in a room that is 3 rooms away from the daylight. Coming around the corner, we've got Zimbabwe, where the original house is in shading, and the extensions are built, and there's 5 households live in that. And if you look at where the doors are, they've basically built a compound. You can get into all the rooms that other people occupy out of open space. It's a compound. The next one round is Azawasi in Ghana, built in 1949, so it's the same age as I am, and it's now being extended really massively for rented rooms and more space for people who live there. And then the last one are some housing built in Mirpur, north of Dhaka, and the original dwellings, a pair of dwellings, are all shaded, and then all the rooms have been built around them. The household who lives there expands, has more room for itself, but also rents out rooms. And this is what happens if people are allocated or sold very small housing at the beginning of their household life. They will expand it. And I've seen this all over the world. Governments focus on dwellings. policy is dominated by ownership of self-contained single household dwellings. But most households don't live like that. They live in rooms. Okay, 5 minutes, okay. And also, a single household dwelling is too expensive for most of the renters. And it's renters we have to look at. They're the house owners of the future. Owners are okay, they've already got their housing. The pictures are Georgetown in Guyana and in Liberia. Okay, governments have focused on mortgages over the last 20 years, often subsidized. And they've been looking at mortgage improvement instead of improving housing supply. People talk about housing being too expensive. In my experience, housing is very cheap. It's just that people's wages are too low. This is a very common triangle which we see now, and it shows that the people at in the green, the 3% at the top of the income scale, can afford mortgages, and everybody else can't. So those of you who are in mortgages, please think about the people who are in yellow and red who can't afford your products. And this is the equivalent in Uganda, with only 0.7% of households being able to afford mortgages. 0.7%. Okay? Some countries have started housing provident funds, seen as a panacea, but they're not usually very successful for the poor. They're only available to salaried workers, and the transaction costs of the loans are often very high. Got Shanghai and I think it's the American National Housing Trust Fund there. The diaspora are often involved in building housing. Some of the countries have very high remittances from the diaspora. Egypt receives a great deal, and much of its housing is left unfinished and empty. Many governments of us have taken assisting supply as part of what they want to do, but they haven't supported the people who build most housing, which are the small-scale contractors operating single people, labor-intensive. They've gone to the big, high-end contractors and they've subsidized them. So in Ghana, the only people who have subsidized housing in Ghana are the richest people in the country through GREDA, the Ghana Real Estate Development Association, who get subsidized by the Ghana government. Few build mass housing, and one of the ones that does is Ethiopia, and everybody points at IHDP and says, this is the way forward. Friends, it's at least 50% subsidized. It's enormously expensive. Certainly the bottom half of the population can't get near even the 18 square meter IHDP flat. We were talking to them this year, and even the Commercial Bank of Ethiopia, who funds it all, agree. But it allows governments to think they're helping housing supply, and they're not. Some of the housing finance has been used to get the institutions to survive, and they've done it by going right up market. So this gated estate in Lesotho is built by the Lesotho Housing and Land Development Corporation, and this amazing housing on the right is built in Zambia by a Malaysian consortium and the National Housing Authority. And it just reinforces the self-serving impression of government. The subsidies tend to be supply side, which the enabling strategies don't do it. They're often non-transparent, and they're usually badly targeted. On the right is an IHDP estate, which is wholly occupied by middle class people. You can tell by the cars and by the shops on the ground floor that it's really now very high-end housing, all subsidized. Some countries use rent control to subsidize housing. They expect landlords to subsidize housing. And subsidies are usually used for other than housing purposes, to hide poor salaries, to reward loyalty, and to get the diaspora to come back. And they distort housing supply. That's the rent control building in Kumasi, by the way. Pro-poor finance seems to be one of the few places that we're actually doing something serious for the lowest 50% of the population. And the SDI and its affiliates, through the savings groups, are really doing very good work. We've got the women and their housing in Angela Govea in Malawi, And then we have Habitat for Humanity, which is also a funder, often much smaller than SDI, and it tends to build more expensively than the SDI affiliates, but it does build in permanent materials. We've got Lesotho and Malawi. This was in the days of the McDonald's approach, where everybody got the same. Habitat for Humanity's branched out in much more and widened its scope. Microfinance it's coming, but it still has the problem of borrowing short and lending long. And it's often more suitable for less than a dwelling, for a room or an improvement. But we need more information, and I would be very happy to get more information from you about housing microfinance that works. So, to conclude, governments have been very selective in what they've taken from the enabling strategies. They've taken the Western view of affordable housing, and it's been an unhelpful focus on whole-owned dwellings. The resulting housing is not affordable to the median household, and finance has focused on mortgages and towards supplies of high-end housing. Rental housing has been ignored. I'm only reading it because I haven't got time to do anything else. Sorry about that. But the ways forward, we must encourage governments to be more realistic in what's affordable, to be looking at rooms rather than dwellings, at sharing, all sorts of shared housing, rental housing, housing not conforming to current regulations. And bankability should not just depend on marketability. There should be some sensitivity to community needs and their ability to pay, perhaps through different forms of collateral. We need loans that are smaller and shorter than mortgages. Non-conventional collateral may be needed, and demand-side subsidies will be required for at least the poorest groups. You cannot house the poorest groups through the enabling approach. It won't work. And community-led initiatives should be supported as a priority. And if you have been, thank you for listening.